Ron Wheatley. I'm one of you, actually, Shannon Fire. And I appreciate the opportunity to come here this morning and talk a little bit about my latest book, which is called The Trial of Phyllis Wheatley. And I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the setting, about the Boston of 1772, when this book is where it's set. If you imagine, you have to kind of go back in time in your mind and think of Boston as like a pear surrounded by water, hanging by a stem that joined the mainland, and then went around to basically the North Shore, the South Shore, and the rest of the contiguous, what is contiguous now. And at that time, this small little pear-shaped island had like 15,000 people on it, and they were very closely nestled together because there were three big hills right on that little island-like thing. Although it is officially a peninsula, it looked like an island. It seemed like an island for every other purpose. And so with those big hills in the middle, there wasn't a lot of place to do a lot of construction of homes and things. So a lot of people, many of the people congregated around the flat land, which is coastland. And so that gives you an idea of the topography. All these people squeezed into this small little place. And as far as the history goes, in 1772, this was on the eve of the Revolution, as you all know. There were factions, as there are today, there were factions that had been politicized that were basically, you've heard it, I'm sure, before, but I've done research on it, and I think it's true. There were three major groups, because going back just, say, to the beginning of, go back 13 years, 1760, was the end of the French and Indian War. We call it the French and Indian War, the Brits called it the 7 Years' War. And what that did, once that ended, it removed the threat from Canada that the people of New England and Boston were really afraid of. And so when that happened, then Britain decided, well, we saved these guys, and so we'd like to get some money from them, and we're still administering this colony, and we'd like to, have them pay some of the fair share, because gee whiz, we're taxing our own citizens in England at a very high rate, and so let's have these. So that kind of started another separate kind of issue. But getting back to the 1773, again, this story is set at that time, and it's about a trial that took place, an actual trial that took place in Boston in 1772. I said 1777, in the fall of 1772. And what the trial was about is this young lady, this absolutely true story, this young lady was brought to Boston on a slave ship, a brig, and this was in 1760. She arrived at what used to be called Beach Street Wharf in 1760 on this brig, which if you've been down to the old Tea Party, seen those Tea Party ships, it's very much like that. Just a sidebar, in the old days, you hear about these slave ships that were filled with 400 people, and many of them, half of them maybe made it back. But she was lucky because she was put in what they called a loose pack. This ship, the Phyllis, had just been built in right there where where they built the ships, and this was its maiden voyage. It was owned by a guy named Mr. Fitch, who was the biggest slave owner in Boston at that time. And he had a captain whose name was Captain Gwynn. That was the captain of this ship, who was a real kind of humanitarian guy, the way I can understand it. Because he was under strict orders, Captain Gwynn, to not bring back any children. Bring back 60 to 70 slaves, but don't bring back any children. And so what the Phyllis did on her maiden voyage is they sailed from Boston over to what they called the Windward Coast in those days. That was the Gold Coast, that was West Africa. And it is reputed that Phyllis was picked up somewhere in Gambia, Senegal, but I don't think that that's ever been exactly pinpointed. And so I kind of think it could be anywhere from all the way up to the Congo, because I've studied at the route of the ship. But anyway, she got picked up somewhere along there. They had these factories. They called them factories. They would bring people from the inland, captured slaves, usually in tribal wars. They'd bring them down to these factories, and they'd leave them there, and then the ship would come along, and they would, load up to the cargo, and then they would bring it back to Boston. Sometimes they'd go to on the sugar trade and go to the Caribbean. But I think this one, the Phyllis came right back to Boston. So when Phyllis arrived, it was July, and she was at Beach Street Wharf. If you go to Boston today, Beach Street Wharf is just Beach Street. The rest is all fill in. The wharf is gone. So that gives you an idea of the landfill that has occurred. And when I was talking about the repair and the hills, over time, of course, all those things would change. The hills were cut down and the landfill was put in, so Boston's changed so much as we know now, the modern day Boston. But so Mrs. Wheatley, the Wheatleys were John and Susanna Wheatley. They were about 50 years old. Mr. Wheatley, John Wheatley, was a very prominent tailor and also a merchant. He owned a couple merchant vessels. At that particular time, they didn't have. They also had they had twins, teenage twins. In 1760, they had two children in their house that were teenagers. John's the father, Susanna's the mother. The children were Nathaniel and Mary. And they were, at that time, probably about 16, although Nathaniel was attending Harvard. And in those days, Mary they didn't have public education for women. She was being tutored at home. In other words, they were a very well-educated family. So Mrs. Wheatley was like 55, as I said, and her husband said, look, you got to go down, you got to get a slave. The slave ship just came in, notices are out, you got to go down and get a slave. So she went down to, she was a devout Christian. You have to remember, they're both Congregationalists and kind of pillars of the church, of the Old South Church, and you know where that is. And so Susanna went down, I think somewhat probably reluctantly, to get a slave, because they had one other slave, but apparently that person could no longer help. In Boston, the slaves that were taken were just basically household slaves. They never became like, or rarely was it like someone who would work in the fields. Not like you picture from what happened in Virginia. So she went down to this ship, and I've studied it. There's two stories. One, she went to the slave store, which was run by a guy named John Avery, which was down at Beach Street Wharf. And the other story is that she actually went on to the Phyllis. I like the one where she goes on to the Phyllis, because when she went on the ship, or when she discovered this lineup of slaves, wherever the location was, it was, in fact, a situation where the adults were all the adult slaves, to be sold. Africans were lined up, and they were hiding the child. And so as Mrs. Wheatley was looking at examining this parcel, quote unquote, she saw this child, and she thought, oh, her Christian compassion took over, and she just grabbed the child. And I don't know if she had to pay anything or anything, because everybody knew everybody, and everybody was kind of wired. And so she just took the child and went back. She had a driver and a carriage, put the kid in the carriage, and they went home to their mansion in Boston, which was less than a quarter of a mile away. It was located in the shadow of the old State House. You probably all know this area. It's Kilby Street now. It would have been right on the corner of Kilby Street and State Street, which in that day was King Street. So they took her home, and they started noticing after a while that she started taking a piece of charcoal and writing things on the wall and trying to imitate her speech. And Mrs. Wheatley, I call her America's first stage mother, Susanna. She was very impressed by this, and her goal really became to make this young child Christian and to give her an education, and receive her eventually into the Old South Church. So they, within a year and a half, Phyllis was reading fairly difficult passages. Now, Phyllis was 7 years old. The reason they know that, can pretty much assure, she had some missing teeth, baby teeth, and they can kind of judge it's about 7 years. So they brought her home, and within a year and a half, she was being tutored, and within a year and a half, she could read even difficult passages from the Bible. And so that really stunned everyone. And before long, Phyllis was actually speaking English very well and writing. She started to write her first sentences. We have an English teacher who knows about writing sentences, and they were grammatically correct. At that time, the poet laureate of England and of the United States, of the colonial America, was Alexander Pope. Anyway, Alexander Pope. And so she started imitating Phyllis as she grew. She was probably around 12. She started writing these sonnets or poems that were very evocative of Alexander Pope. And so Mrs. Wheatley really picked up on that, kept encouraging her, and what she did is she started taking Phyllis around to her very prominent friends in Boston and having Phyllis recite poetry, her own poetry, and also recite poetry that she'd memorized. And so finally, and this went on for till Phyllis, her first published poem was like when she was 13 years old. It was published in the old Boston Gazette, I believe. So when she went, this went on, and by the time Phyllis was 18, she had composed a slim manuscript of a number of poems, but enough to have in a book. And so Mrs. Wheatley, being the stage mother that she was, took Phyllis to every publisher in Boston. And at that time there were about 6 of them. And every one of them, to a man, said, "Oh, this is wonderful poetry. Wonderful. We love it." But no one's going to believe that this young girl, 10 years out of barbarism, actually wrote it. No one's going to believe that. I mean, you got teenage kids there. You know, let's just say one of you guys didn't write it. There's some kind of a scam. So Mr. Wheatley, being the shrewd kind of political, economic, commercial leader in town, he went to the publishers and he said, "Look, let's do this. If you're willing to do it, if I can get together in one gathering the most eminent men in Boston, say 18 of them, and we can bring young Phyllis in to stand before them and to prove, let them question her, just like a trial, like a jury trial, and that if she can convince them that she is the sole and true author of this poetry, then, and they are then willing to sign an attestation, all 17 of them, including John Hancock, by the way, including Thomas Hutchinson, the governor, including the lieutenant governor, if they would all, and names that are really founding fathers' names. And I'm not making these up, it's part of the record. Would you then publish the poetry with this attestation? And so they couldn't say no. They said, sure, we'll do it. So what happened was, and this involved got to the governor's level, because the governor set it up. Thomas Hutchinson, who was the last civilian governor. You got to remember now, at this time, he essentially became the last civilian governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And the reason was because the war comes. No one knew it at the time, but the next governor was going to be General Gage, so a military governor. So anyway, you have to realize also that there's a political background here that's really kind of interesting. There's a lot of layers to this story. I was talking to Bob this morning. I said, how'd you like the book? Because he bought it earlier. He says, well, I'm about halfway through, and I think I'm getting to the interesting part. But there's a lot of levels that are in there that slowly hopefully become apparent as you read it. He was being criticized by the Hancock group, which was promoting independence. Not so much Hancock, actually James Otis was and Sam Adams. Those were the real firebrands. And they've got things going, so it was getting kind of out of hand. So in 1772, Thomas Hutchinson was hanging on by kind of a threat, a political threat. So I think that he probably went along with this trial idea to try to maybe divert from some of the other issues like the Stamp Act. He actually had supported the Stamp Act. But what he said was, while I support it publicly, I don't, privately I don't. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Looking at today. So anyway, he organized this, they got the men gathered there, they brought Phyllis in, and she stood before him. And she basically, after an hour of intense, who knows, this is the part that no one knows. This is where the play comes in. All I've told you so far is absolutely historical accuracy, but there is no written record of that trial, of what happened in it. What happened in that, the only written evidence of that, what happened in that room, is that attestation I was telling you about, was signed by all these men, including John Hancock. And he signed another document later on, as we all know. But this is kind of a precursor to that other document, and I try to put that into the play as part of the layers. Because there was another document that was signed, and it kind of is an interesting irony of history. I told you about John Wheatley, I told you about Nathaniel. What I didn't tell you is that John Wheatley was a very, very avid loyalist. But his son Nathaniel was a patriot, because he also signed an attestation in 1768 in Dorchester, attesting that he was had become a member of a secret society called the Sons of Liberty. So there's this rift in the family, but it's kind of hidden from the father until the play. So you think about these different groups, and they're all kind of converging in this room, and different religions. They're all Christians, but they're different denominations, you know. So they don't all agree either. It's a good thing. But what I like to think about, you know, there's a lot of revisionism going on today in American history. We think about, you know, we hear a lot about, well, the founding fathers were white, they were all white, they were all rich. Basically, you know, that's all we know about them. But in fact, this group of men who were all white and were very wealthy and were very prominent, they had before them, for the first time, an African American. And they had to come to a decision, and this was a real phenomenon for them, because none of them had ever seen an educated African American. It's just what didn't exist really at that time. Or if it did, I don't know about it. It was very few. So anyway, they had to then come to the decision, knowing that, number one, they could be reviled. Maybe she was lying, maybe the family's lying, maybe and later on it'll come out. And also there was the mob. At this time, you have to realize also, and I didn't talk about it, but very briefly, Boston was ruled by a mob from, say, 1760 to 1765. The vestiges of that mob still existed on the streets of Boston. These were the Sons of Liberty. They weren't originally the Sons of Liberty, but they would then morph into the Tea Party. So, but it was tricky to go out on the streets of Boston, and especially during festivities such as, which is going to happen right the day of the trial, which is going on the day of the trial, which is called Pope's Day. And Pope's Day is in November 5th, which is in memory of Guy Fawkes Day in England, where, you know, the Catholics would try to blow up the Parliament. And he was hung, drawn, and quartered in the 15th century. That was Guy Fawkes, okay? So then Boston, in its own inimical way, took on that tradition, because they didn't like Catholics at that time, to be honest, okay? And so they had on Guy Fawkes Day, Pope's Day, and they would march through the streets carrying effigies of the Pope. They hated the Pope, and they hated Catholics. And it was a celebration. It turned into a melee, but it was kind of the time, the things that they did for enjoyment. So you just kind of, and the trial was going on this day. And so anyway, these gentlemen, to make a long story short, signed the attestation, all of them. And Phyllis then, Mr. Wheatley took the, and Mrs. Wheatley too, the attestation to the publishers in Boston, and they said, yeah, good, but, you know, not so much. Don't think we're going to do it. So then that next spring, Nathaniel took Phyllis on a ship, on their ship, to Boston, where Phyllis had become known, sorry, to England, where Phyllis in London, where Phyllis had become known and well admired. And the book was originally published then in England in 1773. Now, Phyllis is considered the mother of African American literature. It descends from her, so it's considered a matriarchal descendancy. And she then, the rest of her life you don't want to know because it was so sad, and I didn't want to touch that, I don't want to go there. But anyway, that's basically what the book is about. It was produced as a play. It was produced 10 years ago at Bridgewater State College, full production. So it's a script. It's basically the script from the play. So it's a little bit different reading, Bob, than reading. You have to see it. I have actually the video of it. I'm not able to do that here. So if there's any questions or comments, yes.
Are you a descendant of John Wheatley?
I'm the son of the American Revolution via my great 6 generations back grandfather, Elwood Wheatley, Leonard Wheatley, who was on the Continental Line. But I'm still trying to figure out if there's a link to the Wheatleys in Boston. I can't verify that.
Just as a general comment to everybody, you in fact can use this in here. You can hook up to any one of these TVs. You don't need a projector. All you need is the PowerPoint on your computer, and it works.
Okay, so I was going to say, I bought this so that I could make a YouTube presentation because I'm trying to push the book. And if anybody wants to use this same setup, you're welcome to it. Just call me.
Ron, you mentioned that the later life was tragic.
The what? Oh.
Could you detail that a little?
Well,
what happened to her?
What happened was, her great supporters were the Wheatleys. When the revolution really got going, and Boston got shelled by the British, the Wheatley mansion was destroyed. The Wheatley family just kind of dispersed. Nathaniel went to England for a while. It's hard to get it all down straight. But anyway, she linked up with this guy, and I'm trying to think of his name, sorry, I can't remember, but he was kind of a bum, and she didn't know it. He was kind of a hustler. And I think she was prominent, and he was trying to latch on to her. Anyway, they had 3 children. Then he left her, and she really died in poverty on the north side of Beacon Hill. You know, have you been to the Black History Museum in the north side of Beacon Hill? Sometime you should go there, because that's where a lot of the black community in Boston settled. But that's where she died, and the interesting thing is, they don't know where she was buried. She was buried in a pauper's grave. But you can imagine if they knew where she was buried, she'd be in the granary or somewhere like that. But no, it didn't work out.
Did she marry a black guy or?
Black guy, yeah. I don't know. He could have been a freed slave. There were a few,
Yeah.
like Atticus, you know, during the rebellion.
Massacre.
Yeah, at the Boston Massacre. But that's.
Her name was Phyllis.
Well, that's interesting too, because her name, the Wheatleys, when they got her home, she just come across on the bridge, right? Phyllis, and the kids said, let's name her the Phyllis. Let's name her Phyllis after the bridge.
Okay.
And then in those days, if you had, often slaves would take the surname of their master. That was just kind of a general thing that they did.
Well, she more or less became part of the family.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's a good point. I mean, I was hoping that was coming out, because they didn't really treat her like a slave. In
That's
fact,
right.
Mr. Wheatley gave her manumission right around the time of the play, just after when the play took place, around 1773.
She was in fact a free,
Then she was
for
free.
the time, a freed slave.
But see, the Wheatley's goal was, Mrs. Wheatley especially, was to teach her how to become a writer. Well, first educate her, okay? Then when they found this extra talent, they thought, well, maybe she could make a living out of it. And so that was her plan. Her plan was because she was all along, they wanted to free her. They planned to free her, but they wanted to make sure that she was going to be able to support herself. And that's why they promoted her. And unfortunately, the times were against her as far as any kind of commercial aggrandizement. Please.
When was it published here in the America?
It was published in England in 1764 by a company called the Polk. It was a Polk published, P-O-L-K.
1774?
1774. It took about a year.
And never, well, no.
Well, subsequently, she was published here, but, and she's, much honored now. There's Boston, they got a statue to her, and the Wheatley High School, all these Wheatley schools you see around. And I think Boston's very proud of the fact that, she's related to Boston. There's a question back. Do you have a question?
Yeah, what happened to the 3 children? Any record what happened to the 3 children? They amount to it all?
Originally they had 5 children. The 2 that survived were Mary and Nathaniel. Married a prominent Rhode Island, well, he wasn't in Rhode Island then, but John Rothrock, he was a prominent minister, and she married him, and then they moved to Rhode Island. So that was into that. Nathaniel's kind of a mystery to me, because he may have at one point there was a Nathaniel Wheatley wharf in Boston, and found it in an old book, but it was just like one reference to it, and I knew who it was, but I couldn't find any more. So I do think that he had a wharf and some kind of commercial business.
He must have been educated, apparently.
He'd gone to Harvard. He graduated. They all graduated from Harvard around, in those days, like 16 years old, 17 years old.
What about Phyllis Wheatley's children?
They all died. That's a good question. In fact, she was found dead so I don't like to talk about that part of the story. But one of the prominent characters is John Hancock, because he really was there. And in my play, quote unquote, the only fiction I've done is I've taken every word from this is from her, or from them, John Hunt, their own terminology, their own word. And so I knew he was in that room, so I made him the defense attorney for Phyllis, even though he wasn't an attorney. But, so there's this contest between John Hancock representing Phyllis and the governor, and the lieutenant governor is kind of a thug. But not really, but I mean, you got to think about this. I mean, you get a lot of dissonance when you read this history, because it wasn't all bad and all good. You can't say that all the patriots were great and all the loyalists were bad. Thomas Hutchinson had his house burned. He wrote, by the way, he wrote the seminal history of Boston. His ancestor, Anne Hutchinson, 2 generations back, was the witch that got tried, and then she died in exile. Well, the irony of history is he did the same thing. He wasn't a witch, but after all he did for Boston, he died in exile. They kicked him out. And the same with Andrew Oliver, the Lieutenant Governor Andrew Oliver. He's the guy that was hung in effigy, burned on the Liberty Tree.
I was about to ask you whether or not he was descendant of or related to Anne Hutchinson.
Yeah.
There's recently, last month I believe, performed an opera of the trial of Anne Hutchinson.
Is that right?
And in Boston, yeah, there's a contralto in the church that I go to in Winchester that sang the lead.
Well,
It was the very first opera I've ever been to. It was good and interesting.
sounds interesting. I'd love to see that. Would you do me a favor and ask them if they'd be willing to put on, turn this into an opera?
Yes, well, it did it.
Ron, not too long after this 1772 period, Chief Justice Cushing.
Exactly. Oh, yeah.
He effectively ended slavery in a decision in the Walker case. So Massachusetts was the very first state in the Union.
Was the first?
That de jure anyhow ended slavery.
Right. That's a really, really good point, because that's something I didn't bring up, which is also in the book. William Murray, Lord Mansfield. At the time, the summer before this play, William Murray was Lord Mansfield. He was like the Supreme Court Chief Justice. It was called King's Bench in England. We call it Supreme Court. William Murray was a Scotsman. And he, in a seminal decision in July of 1773, had ruled in a case, the Somerset case, that this was an escaped black, an escaped black in England who was captured by his master, and he was being brought, he was going to be deported out of the country, and he was saved at the last minute by a few abolitionists who got him who got a writ from William Murray. Bottom line being that William Murray was then, who didn't want to do it, was faced with declaring either slavery legal or illegal. It had been an issue in England. It had been an issue that had been battered around and had never been adjudicated. And certainly there was nothing in Parliament, no laws. And so what William Murray did in his decision was he said that he basically says it's a wonderful decision. He says that slavery is not countenanced by the heir of England. The heir of England is too pure to have slavery. And that's what Chief Justice Cushing used in that decision that you're talking about, the precedent. But the problem with judge-made law, which we call common law, is that it's not as powerful as statutory. And the decision of William Murray wasn't statutized until 20 years later, or whatever it was. And in America, even though we were a colony at this time, we should have been able to take that decision of William Murray and said, well, this is a precedent. And the only one that did Chief Justice Cushing.
And he was a Situate guy.
And he was Situate. It's a wonderful point, wonderful connection. Yes, sir.
Just a personal word on the book. As Ron said, it's in the form of a play. At the same time, with background information and a dialogue in the play, it's a real history lesson. A lot of what Ron has told you here is in here, but in much more detail. The comment I made about getting to the interesting part is a personal thing. The first act is essentially about relationships. It's about the relationships between Phyllis, her mistress, the daughter of the mistress, and I'm not really into relationships. The second act is getting into the politics of the era, I think. And that's why I said that's the interesting part. It doesn't mean the first part isn't interesting to somebody else.
I'm just kidding you.
I know, I understand that, but anybody that's interested in colonial history, there's a lot in here.
Another question. Now, Mrs. Wheatley's task was to go down to the Phyllis or somewhere and to purchase a slave for the household. Did she ever go back and get?
No, they never had any other slaves, and that was the end of that.
And as to the book, can I purchase one?
Oh, sure. Now if you go online, they're like $15, but I'll sell them for 10.
So,
It is a history lesson. It's from that point of view, and thank you, Bob, for your comment. And yes.
Was there anything published beyond her original document? Did she
This
publish
is
more poems?
this is a good question, and I can't with any authority tell you yes, there was. They were planning a second book, and I know that didn't happen, but there may have been a poem or two that she wrote that did get published. If you could find, it's a very valuable thing. They just found a Phyllis Wheatley poem that had been published somewhere in a newspaper and sold for millions of dollars. By the way, the guy who's really the guru on Phyllis Wheatley is a guy named Skip Gates. Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates of
Beer Summit.
Beer Summit. And I read his book, and the thing that bothered me about it is he doesn't talk about the Wheatleys so much. He goes right into Thomas Jefferson and how Thomas Jefferson was a racist because he didn't like her poetry. But Thomas Jefferson, in my opinion, Thomas Jefferson had nothing to do with it. Thomas Jefferson, that'd be 20 years later when Thomas Jefferson saw a poem, and he made a comment, yeah, this isn't that great. And, to turn that into a book. And my goal here was to make it just the opposite. That the focus is on the Wheatleys and what they did, and that they weren't racist.
Do copies of her book exist, her poems?
In reprint. You can get, if you go to the Athenaeum, the Athenaeum in Boston, or if you go to, the Athenaeum's the only, or maybe the public library, the main public library in Boston. I haven't seen her actual manuscripts, but they brought me out on a pillow. If you've ever gone to a rare book, look at a rare book in the library, they'll do that. They have gloves on and bring it out, and they watch it like a guard as you look at it. But I've never seen the actual script.
But reprints of
Well, there would be, we have many reprints of her poetry, many. Any bookstore, any good bookstore.
Any anthology of American poetry.
Yeah, right, exactly. You gotta remember, she was the first African-American woman to publish, and also the first poet. So it's the double, she's here in double trust. As Hamlet knows, Macbeth.
Most anthologies have a
I'm
poem.
sorry?
Most anthologies have a poem which she wrote to George Washington,
Oh, exactly.
praising him as the country's leader.
That's a very good point. If you wanted to say something about that, I could just add one thing. She actually met with George Washington. She wrote a poem in praise of him, and she mailed it to me. And his aide-de-camp got a hold of it and gave it to George Washington and said, this is gals in Boston, what should we do? And this was at Cambridge, 1775, when he just got his headquarters tent set up. And one of the first visitors he allowed to come in was Phyllis Wheatley. And he thanked her. And I remember reading that he didn't know, you know, he was a Southerner. And they had their own ways with slaves. And he didn't know what to call her, you know. He was kind of stymied by that. And so he called her Miss Phyllis. Oh, and the last thing I'll add is, thank you for that, is that Pope's Day, another George Washington connection. What happened was, that was the last, I think this was the last Pope's Day ever celebrated in Boston in 1773, because as soon as the Continental Army got going, many of George Washington's troops were captured, and they were his best troops. And so, by general order, he put out that anyone in the military participating in Pope's Day is going to be court-martialed. So that was the end of Pope's Day.
You wrote the manuscript for the play, and then the book
I had to kind of,
so you used the manuscript
yeah,
as a
it's
basis
based on
for
it's a script. It's basically a script, but with a lot of background information to try to put it together. The whole idea was to bring Phyllis alive for young people, so that, you know, actually, you could read a book about someone, right? This is my theory. You can read a book about a biography, but to see them actually alive, to see them on a stage performing, it's a little different dimension. And that was kind of my goal. Hopefully it worked in play, actually. It got a good, very good reception. Yes, sir.
I saw The Color Purple as a musical.
Yeah.
It was absolutely wonderful. It was great. I could understand it. I couldn't stand it. It wasn't in this. But Phyllis would be great in a musical.
It would be. That's what I was thinking.
That's,
you know, if anybody here can
that'd
write
be
music,
perfect.
Dancing her way into your heart. That's right.
There's a big chance.
At least the tap dancing.
so I guess that's it. Thank you very much.
Just one comment. Ron's selling books, so please buy them. But